questions about the midterm material, because most of you might have read the questions by this point. So any questions about anything there that's not clear? Yeah?
I just have a question. So for example, if you ask us, I don't remember the question, but, well I do, but not specifically. If you had how would you test for this? Do you want us to give you like the methods specifically and then give you a step-by-step kind of methodology of what we would do, or just like describe the method generally and why it's applicable and the downsides?
Yeah, I mean, just the method generally. It's probably going to give you an example, but like, I'm not going to ask you, was it published by Fitzjohn in 2010 or 2011 or anything like that? Or what program would you use?
What if you already did that?
What? That's great. Other questions, things that weren't clear in the midterm? No? Okay, good. All right, so you're talking about sort of follow on last class and start talking about inclusive fitness. Okay, so here's the build-up, the scary build-up, right? Was Darwin wrong? Was it failed to his entire theory? What's he talking about? Okay. No, he wasn't wrong. He was wrong about some things. Don't marry your cousin. But what he's talking about here, he was actually okay with. Right? So I'll give you a chance to read this. So here's his problem. I know there's just 3 sentences. Darwin's really good at having long sentences. All right, so what's his problem? Rephrase what the issue is here. Right. So how can this really be selected for? Good. Excellent. So, and if it is selected for, it can be passed on, certainly. Right? Because sterility have no offspring. Okay, so here's the basic problem. And also not just sterility, also the other traits. So he's actually thinking about social insects. So here's the ants, here's the worker ant, what we see usually. Here's the queen, okay, so it has her wings. You fly off, look at the sky, and workers. And so workers have this very different phenotype from either reproductive. But how do you select on that? Because you have, let's say, have a variation in the workers, right? Have some workers that are bigger and some workers that are smaller. How do the ants evolve to having bigger workers that are adaptive if the workers themselves have no offspring? Okay, so here's the problem. All right. So what you do is break up into groups, start thinking about what the solutions might be. We'll then talk about what Darwin thought the solution was. Okay. So again, how can we have traits like sterility be selected for and passed on, even though they have no offspring? What's that? Oh. Okay. They seem nice. Have folks solved it, or have you given up? Give up? Like, curiosity, how many of you have actually read The Origin of Species?
I have it. It's sitting on my bookshelf.
For those of you who are going into like evolutionary biology or ecology, it's actually worth reading. It's pretty interesting. So, it's it seems like once you get used to the long sentences, it actually has lots of really cool insights about evolution. Like, oh, yeah, he was thinking about that way back then. Okay. Dude, we missed the pigeons. Darren has so much more about pigeons. Okay. Also, Darwin's book was an abstract of his full book he was working on. So this is the condensed, Reader's Digest version. All right. It's free online, so you don't need to pay any money. All right. So, what do people think? What's the solution to this? Oh, actually, those of you who found it hard, what were you getting stuck on? Yeah.
So, I remember reading Japanese paper that things that help societies are like, sexuality, grandmotherhood, things that are seen as like helper traits benefit the society as a whole. Like that doesn't explain how those traits
Don't become what at?
don't why those genotypes don't get purged out. Even if that helper trait is helping them fitness and other individuals, that genotype helping
Okay, good. Yeah, so an ant, if you have, imagine, the ant, it's a sociality thing, and you say, okay, I'm going to have the babies, and you go off and go fight spiders and get food. Okay, good plan. Right? So you're right. I mean, why would that trait evolve, and why would it persist? Good. Okay. A lot of people had trouble with this. What's hard about this? Okay. Those of you had solutions. It's Darwin's dilemma. It wasn't hard. You had no solutions. Solutions? Anyone? In ants now, they're sterile. That caste when they're close as adults, they're sterile. In general, in other social insects, sometimes there's cheating. It's like worker bees can lay eggs. But then there's things like policing where other workers will go around and kill the eggs of other workers. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, so helping in some sort of deleterious mutations, like Muller's ratchet, where like at some point you go downhill, but you go downhill towards helping. You get away from helping. That's a good hypothesis. Okay. Good. So relatedness. Good. So maybe some sort of selection for you're better off producing siblings than you are producing offspring. Okay, good. We'll get to that. What else?
If the workers contribute to the fitness of the queen, then the selection favors queens that produce more efficient workers.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Yeah, exactly. So selections on the queens themselves, those queens that happen to produce the best spread of workers, the most efficient workers, have more offspring, right? So same way that your hand isn't going to have offspring if it works well as a hand, right? But you might have more offspring if you have hands that work well. The workers are the hands of the queen. Different individuals, but they help her overall fitness. Yeah. There's some sort of efficiency argument where you keep your reproductive tissue in one place and your other somatic tissue. Yeah, interesting. That's good kind of. So here's Darwin's reasoning. I'll give you a half hour to read it. I only look up one word too, so I include the definition for you when you get to it. Alright, so what does this mean? Mm-hmm. Yep. That and what else did he say? What about inheritance? Mm-hmm. And also the particular traits, close relatives will pass on those traits. So if you have a tasty veggie, other veggies from that plant probably are very similar, and so they'll inherit that tastiness. Good. So one thing to note here is, so we're talking about selection on the community, right? Did he talk about cheaters? No. This one hasn't addressed yet. The other thing to note when thinking about inheritance is he's not talking about genes. Why not? Right, it wasn't known. It's Mendel published, but only read the paper. So, until the rediscovery of Mendel, I think 1900, it was, oh, it's gene things. And then set the stage for the modern synthesis later. Okay, we've combined genetics and evolution. Okay, but at this time, Darwin didn't know about genes. Even without knowing about genes, he knew about inheritance, right? And actually, a lot of the Origin of Species is dedicated to showing, that relatives have similar traits. So you can select for, pigeons that have really cool feather collars and things like that. Okay, good. So here's how Darwin deals with this. Right? Now we're going to go a little deeper into some of the more modern thinking and even have an equation. You'll handle it okay, it'll be fine. Right. So, glossary of some of the terms we're going to be talking about. Actor. So the clear we care about is performing a behavior. Okay. Altruism. Okay. So it's a trait that seems to have a cost to the actor and benefit a recipient. Okay. Now there's some fuzziness here. So, for example, if your brother is dying and you throw him a rope, right? Well, it has some cost to you, right? It's a lot of work to throw a rope, right? But it has a huge benefit to your brother. Okay. Overall, it might mean that your genes are spread in more individuals because your brother can have kids. Right? So it might overall have a benefit to you, even though the act itself has a cost. Okay. So one sense of altruism is something that has some cost, but might actually have an overall benefit. And a stricter form of altruism says that the overall cost is higher than the benefit to the individual. Okay. We're going to use a sort of softer definition. That's sort of a conflict in the literature. Okay, cheaters. Okay, individuals who don't contribute their fair share, right? So if we're all out hunting a mastodon, right, and I sit back and say, "Go guys," and you guys get squashed and injured and stuff, and then we all eat the meat together, I'm a cheater. Okay. Okay, cooperation. Something that benefits the recipient. Okay. Direct fitness. We usually think about when we talk about fitness, right? How many offspring you have, and whether they survive. Okay. Green beard. Come back to this. Okay. But basically, if you're trying to say if a gene is evolving and gene promotes helping, right? Well, ideally that gene is passed on best if you help other helpers who also have that gene, right? And so Dawkins had this idea of a green beard, so some trait you can say, okay, if you have this trait, green beard, I can do my face, but I don't do it. You can recognize other ones that have this trait as well, so you can perfectly help them. Okay. The problem with that is it only works if that physical trait and the helping trait are perfectly correlated. Right? If you have a recombination on separate genes, then you could have cheaters who look green but don't help. Okay. Inclusive fitness is direct fitness, how many offspring you have, plus indirect fitness. Right? So the fitness you get from helping relatives. Okay, I'll come back to that. Kid selection based on how you help your kid. Okay. Features we know, recipient, within factor or passed upon. And relatedness, how genetically similar two things are. Okay, so what's your relatedness to your sister? Assuming you share the same father and mother. Okay. How would you figure this out? Okay, so let's say here's you, and you have AA. Right. What's the chance that your sibling has this gene? What? 50-50. Right? And so your relatedness is what you have to do with your sibling. Okay? And we'll talk about other relatedness in a minute. Okay, so the model approach you're using, here's the equation, is to use something called Hamilton's rule. Okay, who's heard of this before? Okay, good. So what does it mean? So, relatedness, probably sharing a gene. Okay. Now note, this is probably sharing a gene. This doesn't necessarily mean that you're relatives in other ways. So again, we had the green beard thing. And I can say, okay, I can recognize everyone with a green beard also shares this gene. So probably sharing their gene with one. Even though they might not have common ancestors until way back in history. Okay. B's benefit, recipient, not to you. Okay. And C's cost to you. And of course, the cost to you could be negative. Could be, if it's an advantageous trade, it has a negative cost. Right, so positive net influence. Now, we don't have to explain traits that have a negative cost, right? So the trait that's beneficial to you, okay, that makes sense, it evolves. The question of the trait that seems detrimental to you might be beneficial to your sibling. How does that evolve? Okay. The way to write this equation is RB minus C greater than 0. I subtract the C from both sides. And so if we see this net benefit minus cost is positive, the trait can evolve. That's it. That's the big scary math. Okay. Why is this important? Mm-hmm. Yeah. What's up, buzzing? Right. Right. It's helps explain behavior. So you have some behavior that has some cost to you. You know, if you just look at the cost, okay, how can this evolve, right? So, going to throw a rope to your brother, it's a lot of work to find the rope, right? Why bother doing it? Why share food with your other members of your group? Okay, and so this tells you to look for the benefits to others. Okay. So here's a little diagram of that. So we're focusing on this actor. Okay. And then Dr. direct fitness. These are her babies. Right? And also indirect fitness. Right? By helping this one produce babies and get some benefit from that. Different abilities. How much benefit does it get related to 0? How much benefit would it get? Would the yellow one get if it's R is 0? Zero, right. All right, so that's the basic model. Yeah. It's not going to be adaptive, but it could be a deleterious trait or something that evolves. Yeah. And yeah. And so we're going to so weak altruism. RB minus C greater than 0, and C greater than 0. Okay. Whereas strong altruism is RB minus C is less than 0. Right. So we now have many examples of this. Right. This is controversial. Yeah. Yeah.
0? What was that
If this nets to 0, yeah, it could just drift. Then you have both alleles have equal fitness, and so you can just have drift affecting them. Yeah. Even though they could produce very different phenotypes, your helper or not helper. If there's no net fitness difference, 0. Yeah. Good. Other questions about this? Okay. So Haldane, famous mathematical biologist. Okay. Why is this? Isn't like his cousins? Relatedness. Right? He's not closely related. So he's related to 1/2 to his brothers and 1/8 to his cousins. Okay. Now note, he said this as sort of a hub before this was published. Okay. He sort of truly knew this role. He's never bothered publishing it. But you can understand because I mean it's so simple. Three variables, right? It helps explain a lot. Okay. All right. So this whole idea of inclusive fitness, where has it been important? Okay. And it's been important in figuring out sex allocation, releasing, so you think about workers' political events, resolution, operation, altruism, spite. Okay. So spite is where you do costly behavior to hurt something else, use this benefit. Okay. Like we were talking about the other day with punishment, like the guy in the stocks, the guy who wasn't in the stocks, why is he hurting this nice man in the stocks? Well, someone could have more benefit to him, right? So you imagine if R is less than 0, right, you can get overall benefit from hurting someone else rather than helping your relative. Okay. Discrimination, preferentially helping your kin. Okay. Perhaps that relative very interesting. Okay. So think about a disease invading you, right? So you get the flu, right? What could it do? Well, it can make you sick, right? And it spreads by making you sick. If it makes you really sick, you die, and it doesn't spread anymore, right? If it makes you not sick at all, then it doesn't spread either. Like, you don't sneeze, you don't cough. It could probably be sexually transmitted, but for this moment, you can't be, okay? Other traits like that, you have to have some sort of physical manifestation of the disease. Okay? What affects how virulent it would be? So what is the evolutionary pressures on it? Right. Also trying to maximize its overall, R, its overall spread rate, right? All right. So what if you have 2 different viruses on you at the same time? 2 different strains. How are they under selection? In what way? Well, imagine you had one that has very low level of infection, so you could live forever with it, right? And you sort of spread it slowly, sneeze occasionally. And then one that causes you to be horribly sick, spread a lot, and then die. Right? So you might have equal numbers of offspring overall, right? But the one that's more virulent would tend to spread better than the other one because the other one's in a body that then dies. It's called competition. Okay? And so basically if you have multiple infections at once, the disease tends to be more virulent. If you have a single individual infecting you, right, then they're all closely related to each other, and they have better fitness so they could spread out the infection longer. Okay? And so you actually see in cases of diseases where you get infected by multiple organisms, they can tend to be more virulent. But the ones that get infected by one organism is less virulent because they're more closely related to each other. Okay. Sibling conflict, function of elements, cannibalism, dispersal, alarm calls. Okay. So used all over the place. Okay. Yeah.
What's an example of spite?
Of spite. I can't think of one. I know there are some. And does anyone else think of one? Of spite in nature? I guess actually, yeah, policing would be a form of spite. You're right. And policing is just about looking for eggs and destroying them. That sort of narrow focus, where spite's more general class. Because you're more closely related to your mother's offspring than you are to your sister's offspring. And so by getting rid of your sister's offspring, you can, especially when your mother's daughters, you can then increase your own overall fitness. Yeah.
Initially, probably the goose is going to defend itself, but it may retain that anyway. It might try to make something harmful to you later on to get you like harmful.
Yeah.
So like has no meaning. It's defending itself.
That wouldn't be considered spite. Yeah, I mean, and all these sort of like, I don't know, so like game theory of last time, right? It's sort of this evolved behavior, and it's not really, it does not usually doesn't involve a memory process. I mean, there are so a lot of mechanisms we see also involve memory too. What we're talking about here is just sort of overall fitness. But that becomes important when we start talking about why we have these behaviors in general. Yeah. That probably could be considered spite. Yeah, because I mean it has some cost of shoving them out, because the overall benefit to the other offspring. Yeah. Cool. Genomic imprinting is also very important. Do you know what this is? So a new area of study. Basically, you inherit genes from your father and mother, but they can be sort of turned on and turned off based on methylation or other processes. So you can stick methyl groups onto the DNA. And so genes from the father tend to that promote larger size can be turned on, right? Because in species that aren't strictly monogamous, right, that particular female might not be with that father again, right? And so it's better for him to have his offspring get all the resources he can from that one female. Whereas for the female, she'll have other offspring that are equally related to herself, so she wants to spread out her reproductive effort and not use it all up in one offspring, right? So the paternally inherited genes kind of try to get as many resources as they can for the offspring, whereas maternally inherited genes sort of counteract that. Even though then they get resorted in the offspring. Okay, it's a very interesting process. Okay. And here's information about where these are being used for, where this fitness theory made predictions. So, you usually see this sort of sex ratio, and you can go and test. You see this sort of sex ratio. Okay. And these two tables come from a Nature paper. Okay. So these are all. So if you read literature, you might see a single author paper, a paper with 3 authors, a paper with how many copies is it? 30. Okay. This was something showing how science works. So there was 2 famous scientists and a 3rd scientist who published a paper about how inclusive fitness isn't a useful theory anymore. It doesn't explain anything. It has made no predictions. And everyone in the field said, "Nuh-uh," basically, and started writing counterpoints to this paper. And this is just one of them that showed, all these cases where it has been useful. Okay. And just see sort of science is correcting. So you have someone who, one of the people who wrote the paper saying that inclusive fitness isn't important is Ed Wilson, E.O. Wilson, who's super famous, right? Big ant guy, has autobiographies, always on the news, right? So high mucky muck of science, and yet he had a bad idea, what people think was a bad idea, and then everyone rushes to correct it. And this just shows how science works. Okay. Okay, here's a nice study that actually measures empirically sort of inclusive fitness. Okay, so here we have these bees, okay, and they can form nests with queens and workers or solitary nests. Okay. And These are haplodiploid. What does that mean? Right. And so they're haplodiploid. What does that mean? They have 3 sets. Yep. So in Hymenoptera in general, males are haploid, and females are diploid. Okay. So for female to her offspring, she's half and half. That's for each, right? So she has 2 alleles. And for each allele here, she's going to pass going this way or this way. Right? But for siblings, right? So she has a female has much more relatedness to her mother's offspring for a female than she has 2 months offspring for a male. Okay. And so and also better related to her mother's offspring than to her own female offspring. Right? And so she's better off raising her sisters than she's raising her daughters. Okay? Which sort of leads to evolution of eusociality. But the only way you can get eusociality. Okay, so Nick and Lowras are eusocial between the monks in the zoo, and they're not haplodiploid. Okay? This is one of the notes. Okay? And he actually looked at overall fitness, so inclusive fitness plus direct fitness. Indirect fitness plus direct fitness for queens, moon workers, and solitary females. Okay? And it's much higher for queens and workers than for solitaries. Okay? Part of it is, these ratios, and part of it is that the workers provide enough help to produce more offspring. Okay? Make sure those. The workers are all female. Yeah. So yeah, queens are female, workers are female, solitaries are female, and they're diploid. The only haploid ones here are the males. This is her offspring. Yeah. Okay. We also use empirically in things like bacteria. Okay, so here's an result of an experimental study where these bacteria are producing cytophores. So these enzymes they express to help grab iron or other things from the environment. Okay, and so it's this communal benefit, right? Let's go and excrete this thing that will help us all, right? And how often do you do that? So if you're in a situation where you have low competition and high relatedness, you do a lot. Okay. With high competition and it's high relatedness, you don't do much. And then with low relatedness, you don't do much at all. Okay. We often see this sort of inclusive fitness thing when we're talking about mammals too, right? So lions, right? We have a few females breeding and everyone's helping. Okay. Coyotes, you have helping between individuals. Okay. In some birds, we have examples of birds where the offspring from one year hang out in the nest the next year and help feed the babies. Right? And so we figure out why that might be. And so, then you can probably see this. So one idea here is yes. So here's inclusive fitness, one explanation for that. Right? So by helping mom raise your siblings, your genes get passed on to your siblings. Right? So that's one way. But of course there are other mechanisms too. Right? So one is you gain experience. So okay, by feeding your siblings, you learn how to babysit, and it's your turn to have offspring. care of them, and sit on them. That's why they have more cooperative breeding and learn not to sit on babies. Things like that. It could be helping in the future, right? So maybe you inherit the past from your parents. So maybe if you cooperate with someone else, you can then take over no one's territory. Okay. Remember we saw before class one day we saw a movie about ants in the desert, and you had a group of unrelated ants that formed a nest, unrelated queens that formed a nest together, and they together have a better chance of that colony surviving or working together. And then later on, of course, the incentives switch and they start killing each other. Remember, at first they cooperate and it helps them. Okay, so there are other ways of helping, other ways of causing cooperation besides inclusive fitness. We usually help them. That's one important factor. Okay. So if what matters is, RB is greater than C, right? Well, you'd want to preferentially help those that are relatives of you, right? How can you do that? And so paternity testing isn't really widely spread in nature, right? So what are the things you could use to assess relatedness, to know who to help? Pheromones, so you could have things that smell similar to you. Okay, good. How else? Yep, family groups. So if we're raised by the same mother and same nest, we're probably related to each other. Yep. What else? Possibly phenotype, you could recognize similarity. I'm not sure there are any ones that do that, but it's certainly possible to look at. Yeah. Yep. Yeah, mate guarding. Yeah, and there's been a bit of work on that recently. It was published in PNAS, one in Nature, about monogamy in mammals and how that evolves. Yep. Good. Right, but they identify like a mated pair or a mated pair and offspring. Do offspring look like oh, you're my cousin, or not? Yeah. Yep. Yeah, I mean, so parents helping offspring, it's easy to know who your offspring are if you're a female. It's harder if male. But this inclusive is even wider spread. Another thing that can help is sort of spatial clumping, right? So if we have various inbred populations, right? So you come across another group, they're probably most related to the things that you hang out with than the ones in the other group because you've been inbreeding for a while. Okay. So the only way you can get this cooperative behavior is by this relatedness coming just from spatial structure. Okay. And this is all very interesting just in terms of understanding animal behavior. It also, people look at the animals we care about, the animals we care about most are humans, and people doing lots of these studies to figure out why humans cooperate as well. Okay. Is this limited to animals? We saw one example not, right? The bacteria that produce the cytophores. How about plants? Can you imagine this happening in plants? Yeah. So explain. So it could be. So it depends. So it could just be that has a net benefit itself to that plant, right? If you kill the other plants nearby, doesn't matter if you're helping your siblings or not, it still has enough benefit. But if you're in a mixed stand or something, if you're in a large stand, something that could definitely, if this guy stopped producing those chemicals, then others are still producing chemicals that could sort of cheat. So maybe the maintenance of it in large stands comes from this sort of process. Yeah. What else? Other examples on animals you could think of where inclusive fitness might matter. Mm-hmm. And do we know if they prefer to do it to relatives, or will they do it to any of the mycelium?
They would be others, but
Yeah. And there could also be spatial structure, right? So if your offspring tend to be near you, if you help a plant at random, you're helping tend to be helping a relative. Because it happens to be near the basis of it. Good. Other examples in fungi people can think of, or other groups? Okay. So the main points I want to pick up from today are Hamilton's rule. Okay. Think of what relatedness means. Okay. How these sort of seemingly altruistic traits can evolve, and also something about the nature of science and how people compete in science and point out flaws in those research. Okay. Any questions? Okay. On Monday when you come in, I want you to be in different seats. Okay, so you've been talking to the same people all semester. Move around. Ideally, move around vertically too. So those who are in the front move to the back, and vice versa. If you have some reason to stay in the back, some reason to stay in the front, do so. If you can't see well, or you want to go to sleep, But other than that, move around vertically too. All right. Thank you.